We're in truly the home stretch of the book of Hebrews, new priesthood, new hope, new covenant. I could have finished the last 17, 18 verses today, but I thought that felt a little rushed, so we're going to almost finish. Then we'll break for the 3 weeks of holidays. And then we'll have a guest speaker first week of October. Our very own Don Jones will be bringing us the word. And then I will be back from vacation that next week, and we'll finish up the book of Hebrews. And we'll also give an opportunity for any questions. You know, every series that we do, we give you an opportunity to ask questions regarding the series, to give testimony. How has this changed your perspective? What difference has this series? Making a more or less a 40-week or 39, whatever week, investment in this particular book. I want to know that our investment paid off. So we'll have an opportunity to do an open line Saturday and be able to hear from you guys. That'll be basically 1 month from today. So let's get into our text. Let's see previously what we covered in the book of Hebrews. And by the way, let me give you a little teaser. I have here in my hot hands, I have a stack freshly minted prayer requests just from our attendees today. These are not the ones that we've been receiving online. This is not the stack that we have backed up that we've been praying for already on our prayer line. This is fresh for today. We'll do this at the end of our service. So something to look forward to. But what we covered last week in this holiday, we saw in this passage rather, we saw chapter 13 commence, first 6 verses, commenced with 5 community obligations. Chapter 13, very practical. These are practical exhortations on what to do, how to put into practice that great quantity of theology we got in the first 12 chapters. We saw that we must continue and build in brotherly love together. We saw that we had an obligation to exhibit the love of strangers. That's strangers. Of course, my last name, Ger, in Hebrew is sojourner or stranger. So love me. Love of strangers, not strange people necessarily, but strangers, right? Because you never know when you might be entertaining angels in underwears, angels unawares rather. But we need to exhibit a concern for suffering believers, believers who are suffering near us, adjacent to us, in our proximity, and also those who are suffering abroad in other nations. This is a map of the persecuted church from opendoors.org, and it only includes, you can see, the top 50 persecuted churches, or I think actually these are severely persecuted or super severely persecuted churches. There are only 170, 80, whatever it is, nations in the world. So if 50, that more than 25% of the world's nations of believers, our brothers and sisters are being persecuted. We need to be aware of that. We need to stand in solidarity with them, and we need to be lifting them up in prayer. It's not like the other 140 or 130 nations. The believers within those borders are getting off scot-free with no persecution. It's just that they're not severely persecuted. So those are the rest that you see in white. Those believers are just plain vanilla persecuted. We need to be praying for our believers on an international, national, and an international scale. We need to protect, we have an obligation to protect marriage and marital relationships. And that begins really with an awareness of what sexual immorality is. I guess if you asked your average person on the street today, if they could define anything that was particularly sexually immoral, I don't know that you'd be able to get an objective, accurate answer. I can't think of anything that our society, maybe just a few things, but there are still people, depending on who you ask, they might not be able to define them as immoral. So if we can't get sexual purity and sexual immorality, whether we're talking about marriage, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about homosexuality, whether we're talking about relationships with between generations, or whether we're talking about what's happening in our schools today, if we can't get the basics right, how is our society going to get? So it starts with the marital bed. It starts with marital purity, making sure that we don't accept adultery, and keeping our marital relationships pure and holy. And finally, we have a community obligation of financial contentment. Financial contentment. And of course, between sex and money, these are the two highest, largest topics of arguments between families and couples that exist. Having done my share of marital counseling over the decades, these two are number one and number two with a bullet. And so we have an obligation to maintain financial contentment be content, in other words, with what we have. And we saw over those 5 obligations last week, we saw that Yeshua's blood most assuredly impacts almost every one of the areas that I had listed. That's not an exhaustive list, but that is a broad-based list of things that we're concerned about in life. And we saw that the new covenant impacts, Yeshua's blood impacts our relationships with the church, our relationships with one another, our particular goals, our desires, our finances, our relationships, our family, our marriage, our career choices, our business acumen, our business involvement, our hobbies, our habits, our education, the things that we explore educationally. And of course, I didn't highlight the vacations or the entertainment or the politics or the time, although I really think if we dug deep enough into those 5 community obligations, we would see that, yes, indeed, Yeshua's blood impacts time and our involvement in politics. What is politics? It's simply what happens outside in the realm, outside the home, outside the church, in the open central sphere of life. That's politics. So, of course, Yeshua's blood impacts that area and has a lot to say about it. Our entertainment choices, our vacation choices, all of these should be chosen with the area of Yeshua's blood, the new covenant, in mind. Concluding exhortation, the last verses that we finished up from last time: make sure your character is free from the love of money, not that you yourself are free of money. That's not what this is talking about. Not the possession of money that's problematic. It's that your character must remain free from the love of money. Not that your pocket should remain free of the quantity of money. It's where your heart is, where your security is found, being content with what you have. So if you have a lot, be content, right? Figure out creative ways of sharing the wealth, literally. Spreading it around. If you don't have so much, be content. If times are tight and finances are tight, be content there, because your security cannot be found in your bank account or in your investments. Your security must be found in the Lord. And that's why we have this connection from this passage regarding Deuteronomy and the Lord saying, I'll never forsake you. I will never forsake you. I will never desert you. That's a promise that God gave Moses and Joshua when they were passing the torch. And so that we may confidently say, this is from the Psalms, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? Our security must be found nowhere else but the Lord himself. That is an exhortation we must take to heart. Yeshua is the mediator of the new covenant. In which area of your life is Yeshua not Lord? We looked at those. We went over each one. We've been looking at them for weeks, giving us the opportunity to yield areas of our life that perhaps have heretofore not been yielded to the Lord, where the Lord in the Scripture maybe has not been consulted regarding choices that we made or will make. Family relations, our education, our habits, our hobbies, etc. We've seen these 5 community obligations, and now we're ready to move on. We begin the next section with 3 religious obligations. We've had 5 community obligations, communal, and now there are 3 religious obligations that this section is all about. And they're broken up into 3 pieces, these 3 obligations. 1, to honor and emulate former spiritual leaders. So former spiritual leaders. Honor them, emulate them, copy them. Number 2, keep Jesus, keep Yeshua at the center of faith. And the 3rd religious obligation is to recognize the authority of the congregation's current spiritual leaders. Now, this may sound, because this is going to be focused on spiritual leaders and recognizing the authority, honoring and emulating, etc., etc. It sounds like it's a self-serving kind of a message that I'm about to give. You better listen to me. I'm your spiritual leader. I didn't choose the topic today. It's the topic that fell as we've been going through verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And who am I to skip over an important passage that, first of all, the original readers of the epistle to the Hebrews needed to hear, and then, by application, a message that we, today, still 2,000 years later, need to hear. Beginning in verse 7, we talk about how we relate to God, and here comes this first obligation. Remember the former leaders. Remember those who led you. In other words, in the past, those people who led you, who spoke the word of God to you, and considering the result of their conduct, imitate their faith. Now, these particular leaders have since died or moved on to another community. They're former leaders. And so they are to call to mind, they are to make mention of those who led you. They led you. How did they lead you? By speaking, by teaching the word of God, preaching the faith to the faith community, rather. The community was to consider the result of their conduct and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, is the same yesterday and today and forever. Now, the second obligation here, indicated by this verse, was for Yeshua to be the undisputed center of every believer's faith. If you are in a community of faith, Yeshua must not be over here in a corner, not be on the side over here, not be on the diagonal. He must be in the very center of this community. We must observe very carefully that Yeshua is the center. And we've heard this verse before. This verse is a very familiar verse, a well-known verse that's often artlessly and heartlessly torn asunder from its original context here in order to prove a particular point about a particular church practice or spiritual gift or hymnal or Bible translation. This is why we need to keep things the same as it always is. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever, and nothing ever better change. But in context, let me show you what this actually means. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. This is the actual word order in the original language. Position of the words gives us the desired level of emphasis. The name Yeshua or Jesus, accompanied by his title, Mashiach, Messiah, Christ. We see this only a few times. The name Jesus and the title Christ. We see it only a few times within the book of Hebrews and twice within this particular chapter. We have Jesus is yesterday and today the same and forever. He does not change. And therefore, we must maintain with fidelity the teachings that we have received regarding our Messiah. So, we see here that this is not a declaration of the timelessness of Yeshua's nature, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. No, it's not a declaration of timelessness of the nature, of the habits, of the identity, the role, the function, or anything else to do with Jesus' person, Yeshua's person. I'm talking about the non-negotiable integrity of the gospel message concerning nothing less than salvation through Messiah. And what's happening here is that message, the integral gospel message concerning salvation through Messiah, is being contrasted with an eccentric faddish teaching to which the community was presently exposed. Check it out, verse 9. Do not be carried away by varied and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, through which those who were so occupied were not benefited. What? What is this saying? It's saying that instead of the Bible teaching that they had received from their former leaders, some members of that current group were being in danger of being carried away by teachings strange and foreign. Here's an example. The heart should be strengthened by food, in the sense that food can influence the quality of a person's character. Something like, you are what you eat. If you only eat the right foods, it will turn you, not that your body will turn one way or that, but your character will be influenced by what you eat. That's nonsense. The heart is strengthened by grace, not by what you eat, through which those who were so occupied were not benefited. In other words, forget about it. It did not give us any kind of benefits. We must keep our theology straight on. And speaking of theology, we build upon the concept of food, and we relate it to the Jewish believing community's spiritual practice and their standing within the contemporary religious system of Judaism. We've gone through this contrast through the entire book, 13 chapters. We're still in that contrast. And he's contrasting Levitical worship in the temple with the home worship of Jewish Christians, believers in Yeshua. And he says, we, believers, Jewish believers, have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle, Levitical priesthood, have no right to eat. Those who trust in the Levitical system, in other words, share none of the privileges enjoyed by the followers of Yeshua. Levitical priests, with their animal sacrifices, had nothing on the Jewish believers and their perfect high priest. It always comes back. Hebrews always comes back to this strong contrast between this is the Levitical system and this is the superior new covenant, new priesthood, new hope system. And so he says, we have an altar that the Levitical priests can't touch. They have no right to eat it. It's superior in every way. It's not my opinion. It's what the text says. I don't know how else to interpret what the text says. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest. Now that's taking you right to Yom Kippur. That's taking you directly to the Day of Atonement. So he's talking about the Levitical priesthood, and then he's going to get very serious and say, not only the Levitical priesthood, but now I'm going to talk about the biggest day of the year in the Levitical calendar, in Israel's highest holy day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The body of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin, they're burned outside the camp. So let me give you an illustration where everybody's familiar with the animals that are taken on Yom Kippur, the bulls that are sacrificed on behalf of the high priest and his family and the fellow priests, and of course the two goats, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks when we explore the Day of Atonement together. But those animals are taken and they are disposed of from the sanctuary courts. They are disposed of outside the camp. You have the symbolic association of these animals, these goats, with the nation of Israel's sin. These could not be eaten on Yom Kippur. They must be disposed of outside the camp. And as the Yom Kippur sacrifices, the Day of Atonement sacrifices, were removed from the temple precincts and taken outside the camp, right here tells us, Leviticus 16:27, the bull of the sin offering, the goat of the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement to the holy place. That's the Holy of Holies. It's the one time of the year that the high priest was able to enter into the presence of God, direct presence of God. And the blood sprinkled on the curtain and on the mercy seat shall be taken outside the camp, and they shall burn their hides, their flesh, and their refuse in the fire. The sin of the priests and of the people had been transferred respectively to the bull and to the goat, and they could not be consumed. They couldn't be eaten. They needed to be burned, and not burned there, but incinerated outside the camp. Therefore, ipso facto, Yeshua also, that he might sanctify the people. What does it mean to sanctify the people? To consecrate the people. This is the perfect sanctification. Remember that the blood of bulls and goats, and again 2 weeks from now we'll be covering this in depth, but the blood of bulls and goats could not perfectly sanctify a people. The blood of the animals could only cover over the sin, could not remove the sin of the people, and it was only good until such time as the people did not sin again, which is why the daily morning and evening sacrifices recommenced the very next day, and why year after year after year there's these Yom Kippur sacrifices, because they didn't last as an expiration date. But Yeshua's blood perfectly sanctifies, sets apart, consecrates, makes holy the people. How so? Through the means of his own blood. Not the blood of a bull, not the blood of a goat, but his blood, which is superior to that of bulls and goats, because it does not cover over sin. It removes our sin and permanently sanctifies us, sets us apart as holy in the eyes of a holy God. And therefore, Jesus, who sanctified the people through his own blood, he also suffered outside the gate. The perfect fulfillment of the Day of Atonement was taken, and he was crucified outside the gate so that he might sanctify the people. John 19:17. They took Yeshua, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is in Hebrew Golgotha. This is beyond the city walls of Jerusalem, outside the city, outside the camp. He was sacrificed, crucified on our behalf, our perfect sacrifice, outside the camp. Anytime you have in Torah, anytime you have capital punishment, you have it occurring outside the camp. For example, the passage in Numbers where the guy violates Shabbat by picking up sticks. You remember the story, right? And they stone him outside the camp. Or this passage in Leviticus 24, starting in verse 10 and following. The son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian, and a man of Israel struggled with each other in the camp. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name of God, took the name of God in vain, and cursed the holy name. And the Lord spoke to Moses, the covenant name of God. The Lord, Hashem, Adonai, Jehovah. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, bring the one who is cursed, who has blasphemed my name, in other words, outside the camp, and let all those who heard him lay their hands on his head, let all the congregation stone him. So in other words, those outside the camp, that was for the blood of bulls and goats on Yom Kippur, and for those who have warranted capital punishment. Of course, our Messiah was sinless, but he nonetheless was found guilty of blasphemy by the high priest and by the Sanhedrin, or at least a portion of the Sanhedrin. See in Mark 14, are you the Christ of the Son of the living God? Right? Again, the high priest questioning him. Right? Are you the Christ, Son of the Blessed One? Yeshua said, I am, and quoting Daniel, you know this passage, Daniel 7, 13 and 14, the Son of Man, you will see the Son of Man, the Bar Enash, sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. How do you like them apples? And tearing his clothes. He didn't like them at all. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said he tore it because he's grieving, he's mourning. What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What blasphemy? Yeshua referring to himself as the Son of Man, Daniel 7, sitting at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. You've heard the blasphemy. They condemned him to be deserving of death. That is why Yeshua was executed outside the camp, theologically. So, because the most pious and knowledgeable Jews of the day condemned Yeshua, the reproach, the shame that our Messiah bore was his. And so, or accordingly, in other words, because of the argument I've just made, the author of Hebrews exhorts the readers, and 2,000 years later, I think, by way of application, exhorts us as well. His voice still speaks. He said, let us go outside. Let's go to him. Jesus is outside the camp. Jesus is no longer in Judaism as a system. We must bear his reproach. We must join him. We must remove ourselves and join him to identify with him and his shame and his reproach as the leaders of Israel found him guilty and rejected him. Judgment was coming upon the nation of Israel. And the author of Hebrews was, for the last time, exhorting his readers to break that association. Do not be associated with those who are under judgment. Judgment is coming, and it would come within just a few years with the cataclysmic destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So we must bear his reproach. We cannot pretend that we can straddle both worlds. I belong to Jesus, but I also belong to the Levites. I also belong to the Kohanim. I also belong to Moses. How long halt ye between two opinions, Elijah would say. You cannot serve two masters. This that we are a part of, my friends, is called the Messianic movement, not the Moshianic movement. We are not about Moses. We're informed by Moses, but he cannot be the center, nor can he vie for the center of what we're about or what we put our trust in. It must be Yeshua and he alone. Yes, and if that means that we are not accepted by the Jewish people as true Jews, so be it. I'm willing to bear that approach. I still, almost 6 decades into our lives, into my life, I've still have yet to find somebody who can say to my face, you're no longer Jewish. They can talk about it behind my back and say he's betrayed his people. There's no betrayal when one finds life, to stand with life. When one finds love, to stand with love. When one finds the way, to walk in that way. I have found the Messiah. And Judaism as a system has rejected him. Therefore, I am outside the camp. Jewish ethnically, but no longer a party to that system. I am no longer under the Mosaic covenant. I stand firmly and gratefully and humbly within the new covenant that was ratified by the blood of our Messiah 2,000 years ago. So let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. Yeshua is no longer to be found within the camp of Judaism's religious system. I'm talking about a system. It was urgent that his disciples boldly stand with him. And it is urgent that the Messianic community makes that same stand. I've been in the Messianic movement all my life. And almost all my life, I've heard the heartfelt, plaintive cry of Jewish believers. If we only do this, the Jewish community will accept us as a legitimate branch of Judaism. We cannot fool ourselves. The Jewish community will never accept us as a branch of Judaism. We stand with Yeshua HaMashiach as Jewish and Gentile believers, united together in our Messiah through the new covenant. And we must boldly make that stand. Though none go with me, I still will follow. The readers are called to identify with and embrace the same rejection that Yeshua experienced from the Jewish community. Those of us who are Jewish, we know what it is to be rejected by our very own community. We know what it is to be rejected, in some instances, by our very own family. I have the scars. Some of you have the same scars that I do. I have the receipts of family members writing me hateful letters about my grandparents rolling over in their graves if they knew what I was teaching today. If they knew the meshumad, the traitor I had become. I will stand with Yeshua no matter what. Because I have a long-term perspective, and that's what the author is saying. Now, we don't have a lasting city. We're seeking a city which is to come, not a city, the city, which is to come. We look forward to that heavenly Jerusalem. We know what the future holds for us, no matter what our present is like. We know the ending, and we maintain a future perspective to our faith, and that gives wind to our wings. Here we don't have a lasting city. We're seeking the city which is to come. Frankly, when the author was writing, the earthly future of Jerusalem was very bleak. And within a few years, Jerusalem would be conquered, vanquished, the people, half the people exiled, and taken to slavery or killed, the temple itself destroyed. But we know that our future city is secure, coming from heaven. And therefore, we must keep our eyes on the prize. How to maintain a future perspective? Keep your eyes on the prize. Through him, then. Not despite him or alongside him or in solidarity with, no. Through him. Our strength comes not from our own obstinance. Our strength comes only from our Messiah through his Spirit. So through him, Then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that give thanks to his name. Through him is right there at the beginning of the sentence, of the emphatic beginning placed at the head of the sentence. It is not through the Levitical priesthood, it is not through Moses that we offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. It is through him, Jesus, Yeshua, and only him. Not 90% Yeshua and 10% Moses. Yield to him and continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that give thanks to his name. This is a clause lifted directly from Hosea 14. Verse 2, take words with you and return to the Lord. So Hosea is writing to Israel who was strayed. He said, no matter where you are, return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all iniquity. Receive us graciously. No matter what mistakes we've made in the past, we resolve to move forward for your sake, that we may present the fruit of our lips. And then finally, the third exhortation. Do not neglect, actually it's not yet, next verse. Do not neglect doing good and sharing. This is the punctuation of the fruit of the lips, the praise. Do not neglect doing good and sharing with others, not sharing amongst yourself, one for me and one, two for me, and one for me and two for me. Sharing with one another, doing good, not doing good in solitaire or in solitary confinement. Like so many of you watching at home, I know you, I'm talking to you. How can you not neglect doing good if you're not in a community in which you can do good? With whom are you going to share if you are not together with us in community, sharing your gifts with a local body of our Messiah? Do not neglect it. For with such sacrifices, God is pleased. Boy, we sure do appreciate the donations you send us through the mail. We certainly do. Online donations sent through the mail, that's great. But the sacrifices that really please God are those that involve being involved with the community. Using your gifts to interact with others using their gifts. And so that together we can do good. Not a little bit of good over here and a little bit of good over here, but a whole lot of good as we share together. Such sacrifices, God is pleased. All right, here's that final exhortation, which is to, this third religious obligation is to obey your current leaders, to respect your current leaders. What must you do? There's two action words here, two exhortations, two imperatives. Obey your leaders, present leaders, and submit to them. So today, if you hear my voice, don't harden your hearts. Listen, hear with the intent to obey. Obey your leaders and submit to them. How come? For they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. This comes from the concept comes from Ezekiel chapter 3. You know this. Son of man, I've appointed you as a watchman to the house of Israel. And whenever you hear a word from my mouth, warn the people from me. And when I say to the wicked, you will surely die, you don't warn them or speak out to warn the wicked from his wicked way that he may live. That wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand, because you kept your mouth shut. Nobody can accuse me here of keeping my mouth shut. Been accused of a lot of things, but never that. because I feel the weight of having to give an account. Because my job is to keep watch over your souls, to pray for you, to watch out for you, to be concerned for you, to exhort you when I need to encourage you when you need encouragement, to lift you up when you need lifting up, and to correct you when you need corrections. So let them, your current leaders, let them do this with joy and not with grief. Don't give your current leaders a hard time, in other words. Let them do it with joy. Let them find joy in the responsibility God has laid before them, not grief. Not because it would make things unprofitable for the leaders and make their lives harder. And just ask any pastor, any congregational leader, you have any grief? You have any problems in your church, your people? Anybody giving you a hard time? Okay? There's always some group disgruntled for some reason. The coffee's too strong. The sermons are too long. Your speech is too strong. Who knows? But it's not about us. It says, let them do this with joy and not with grief. Because if you don't do so, it would be unprofitable for you. We don't really bear the weight, but the congregations bear the weight. It would be unprofitable for you. Reminds me of The Dark Knight Rises, the third of Nolan's Batman films. And some of you know I'm a movie fan, and some of you have seen this movie. And at the beginning of the movie, he's wearing a mask, and a guy asks him, what would happen if that mask were removed? And he says, it would be extremely painful for you. And that's the issue. Doesn't matter what's going to happen to Bane. The pain will be borne by the one who makes the problem. So honor and emulate former spiritual leaders. Keep Jesus, Yeshua, at the center of our faith. Recognize the authority of the current spiritual leaders. And I'm not complaining, believe me, I'm not. Just telling you what the text says. Put it in the bank and save it up for the future. Hebrews is wrapping up. We'll finish up in a month's time. We'll have an open line Saturday. We'll do the last 5 verses, the conclusion, and then we'll have your comments. But for a few minutes, I'd like to take some time and I'd like to pray for the fresh prayers that came through.